Did the Marshall Court strengthen or weaken the U.S. Constitution?
I think, like, before we argue whether it was weakened or not, it might be good to establish what the purpose of the Constitution was. At least, like, and that's a big opinion too. But like, we can't say it was strengthened or weakened unless we know what it was meant to do. And I personally think that the purpose of the Constitution is twofold. Like, one, it was like a document that was written by the founding fathers in order to organize America around what the Constitution says, and then it could also be just like greater than that, as like a huge model for like democracy and like American enlightenment in general. And I think he weakened the former part of it as it just being a document, but I think he strengthened the like core principles of democracy.
What do you mean by like it being a document?
Like, as in, like I don't think if we think the purpose of the Constitution is the purpose that the original writers gave it, and like it's a document that's in like a rigid sort of manifesto of like the way we value the federal government in the United States, I think he weakened it. But I think as a greater document and like as a model for democracy and as like
The core
and
principle.
from being from a manifesto to an actual like writ of laws, I think he did strengthen.
Well, I think also like we should be talking more about what does weaken or strengthen mean. I remember yesterday we were talking about how weakening the Constitution could mean like removing some meaning from it, like making it what it's trying to say, and then like making it too strict or too like broad. I think that giving power to the Constitution means making it more broad, or at least giving it more meaning. Like that's hard to establish, and I think that's what we should do in our seminar, is establish what the meaning is that it's being given.
I think there also can be a lot of different ways that we can think of like weaken or strengthen, because like the Constitution is kind of hard to remove from the power of the federal government because it's what gives the federal government power. And Marshall kind of unequivocally gives the federal government more power through his court. Like the question is like, and then so in that way he's strengthening it, but also part of the a major part of the Constitution is limiting them. Like a lot of the Constitution is limiting, not granting power. So, and he takes those limitations and kind of, I don't think he ignores them, but he expands the power of the federal government, and he expands where they have power that's not necessarily written in the Constitution. And I think in that sense, he does weaken the Constitution as a document that is able to check federal government.
So are you asserting that the purpose of the Constitution is to check the federal government? Because like there are also places where they're given power, the federal government has to take away power from the federal government.
Not
like
entirely, but I think a large part of it is to limit the power of government, or limit what government can do. And what it does it on both ends. Like it gives the government power, but then it doesn't give the government infinite power.
I think it's less of a limiting the power of the federal government and more saying what the federal government can and cannot do. So I think by like trying to interpret the Constitution, he's like interpreting what the federal government can and can't do, which I mean he's like part of the federal government and part of the Supreme Court. So I think he's like giving himself power and taking away power from the states.
Should we at some point like try to move on to like what the Marshall Court did, or should we like
Yeah.
good one minute asking if we have like okay we should do that?
Things like that.
What do you mean by move on?
Because like I feel like we should, I was wondering if we should have a consensus as to what weakening or strengthening the Constitution means before jumping into it, or we can just go and start talking about the Marshall Court, what they did,
Look at these
and like you
reading
can
examples.
yeah, any reading example. It sounds
Yeah.
good to me.
Yes.
because I think we all have different definitions, but we should apply them to the court.
So should we start with like a case specifically?
Well, I think the I don't know which case is best to start with.
I when I was looking at the Barron versus Baltimore case, when Marshall decided that only the Bill of Rights like restricted the federal government, I was wondering if you guys think that like by only having the federal government like involved and like held by the Bill of Rights, like does that weaken the Constitution because like it doesn't involve the people, or does it strengthen it because like he's only talking about the federal government?
I think it weakens the Constitution because if only a certain number of people are following the Constitution, because that's what they're saying, that only the federal government has to go under the Bill of Rights. I think that I believe that that's weakening it because you're restricting how many people the Constitution applies to.
Also, it kind of goes against what Ben was saying I think you were right in saying that Marshall, for much of his decisions, makes the Constitution in kind of a broader and more ideological document. But I think here he's like saying that he's limiting the Constitution to being really like just a description of government, not a kind of like, because like the Bill of Rights is like, the way I see it a lot of the time is like just it's just stating rights that people inherently have.
It's extremely
But-
ideological.
Right,
Yeah.
but here he's saying like, no, it's really just for like telling the federal government what they can do. It's not saying what the inalienable rights of Thomas Jefferson
Can
talks
you
about.
expand on what you mean by just like defining the federal government, like what the Constitution like does now? You said like it limited it to only defining it or whatever.
Well, it goes from. I'm just saying because the Bill of Rights, he's still saying that still is a limit. That's still like, in that decision, he's still affirming the Bill of Rights as a limit on federal. Like the government can't do certain things, but he also is saying that these aren't like he's almost saying that the rights in the Bill of Rights aren't every person in America doesn't necessarily have these rights, but the federal government can't infringe upon them. But if the states infringed upon them, it's not a bad thing.
So does like expanding the power of the Constitution mean making it have more reach than just the federal government? Like applying, you said, general values to people, like general inherent values people have, would that be more powerful, whereas restricting it just to the federal just to the federal government would make it, I guess, weaker in a sense because it's not the same reach.
I think we should also, like, weaken and strengthen can sort of have negative connotations to them. Like if you think he's weakening the Constitution, we think he's like destroying the country. But I think I don't think that's what the question is asking. It's more of like how conservative or liberal is he with this document, and not like Republican Democrat, but like if you're conservative, like then you think this document defines what the country should be. And if you have a more liberal reading, you think this is a more ideological document that like describes rather than defines what the like American ideology is.
I think you're making a bit of a generalization there. Like, are you saying that?
Well, like isn't that like the two extremes of ways to read the Constitution?
Well, I wouldn't confine them to necessarily liberal or conservative in terms of like.
I'm saying in the definition of those words, not in the party lines.
He's saying either you read them,
Like you read it liberally or you read it conservatively.
Yeah,
As
I
in absolutism
I don't think-
or like able
So you're
to.
saying reading it conservatively would be more You said you don't like the word
to conserve the literal like wording in the original.
No,
So what you mean that to give a vocabulary, the way I think you're getting at here is loose construction versus strict construction.
Absolutism versus.
Meaning that is it only what the exact words? So the example that we talked about with the post office, does it only mean post roads and post buildings, or does it also mean postal carriers and
How strict?
metaphoric can those words be?
But
I think Baltimore's an exception to what
you can
usually
apply those directly to weaken and strengthen.
What?
I don't think you can apply
No,
those
but I just
to-
think it might be an easier way to understand, like what he's doing with the Constitution. Because some things are weak, some things are strengthened, but
All right, pause. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm actually gonna put a pause on this discussion for now. I want you guys to take some notes. We're gonna switch right now to the necessary and proper discussion. Give them about 20 minutes. Then we're gonna come back to this, and we're gonna see how the next discussion informs this one. I want you guys to listen to the discussion they have and see if what they talk about, necessary and proper, sounds like a weakening or a strengthening of the U.S. Constitution. So we're going to come back to that. All right.
So the whole discussion is based around McCullough being Maryland, so I guess,
Can we take like a straw poll, see what people think before talking about it?
yeah, sure,
Who thinks it was right?
the right use of necessary.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Does anyone think it's wrong?
Nice.
Can anyone argue that they think it's wrong?
I can argue that's wrong. Need be.
Okay. So, wait, first, does someone want to say why they think it's right, and then we can say why?
Yeah, I can argue that. So, first I think it's even. I think it's even like explicitly used correctly in the Constitution that that a bank is a logical, even if it doesn't say the word bank, a bank is a logical way of collecting taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and paying debts and borrowing money. Pretty much the first three powers of the Congress in Article and Section 8. And anyways, even if it's not, then it is still I don't know, necessary, but definitely a proper way of doing those things. It might not be the only way, but it definitely works.
Wait, what you just said, that it was.
I was just gonna say, you're saying it's proper, but it's not necessarily
Exactly.
necessary and proper is
It's not
necessary
necessarily
and
not
proper.
or proper, right?
So it's gotta be both.
My explanation of that is that I think there are many times when the Constitution can kind of be broadened from the specific words, meaning that, like what I said, that a bank isn't the only way to do this, but it is a way that works, especially from the beginning. So, like, it's not necessary, but it is, like, I guess you could say better or still acceptable.
So while I did vote yes that it was used correctly, I think that I think in more like a broad sense that a bank should be established in order to achieve these goals. I think it was used incorrectly, but I disagree with the choice to use a private bank and sort of turn it into something that's used best for public use, and that's sort of where I think some of the problems can come from, because like there's a lot of a potential for corruption there, and just like a bigger conflict of interest. So
What kind of corruption, what kind of issue?
well, it's just when you put the money of the government into like a private person, or into like just a couple of rich people who have who are not voted, who have no real authority to be handling this money. I feel like it could lead to some tricky situations. I don't have one in particular.
A congressman could invest in the bank and then borrow money from another country, which would give the bank more money and therefore that congressman more money.
I'm not following, how does that work?
Okay. So basically the bank makes more money through the more people invest in it and borrow from it and take loans from it.
Yes, shareholders.
So And like the more people use it, and since that bank is traded publicly, let's say a congressman could invest in that bank, and then the Congress could borrow like $1 million from, let's say, Britain.
And
That would,
that would give more money to the bank.
and the congressman
Yeah,
who invested in the
exactly.
bank.
It's like the congressman, there's a potential for doing things for his money and not for the good of the country, which is why I think that's a little bit tricky and that the bank shouldn't be something that can be sort of, that can be traded or invested in.
Does anyone disagree with what Adam's saying?
I agree, but the question then is, the reason they chose to use the private bank was because it was cheaper and more efficient, because they didn't have to hire a whole new set of people to run a bank. So does that benefit outweigh the cost of potential corruption? And if it does, can we then apply the word proper to it? And then if we can, then it's constitutional.
No, I think it's constitutional. I think that it's necessary and proper. I'm just thinking it's done almost in like a moral way, looking at the possible problems that could come from it. I think that it wasn't a smart idea to recognize. But I'm saying that it's constitutional. It just has potential to become unconstitutional, if that makes sense.
I don't necessarily agree that it was necessary and proper, because Avi, you were saying that like it's cheaper to go through a private bank, whatever, and not have to like hire other people, whatever, but does that make it necessary just because it's cheaper?
Well, if you have multiple options, but technically nothing is necessary, so I think you kind of have to not put the word necessary aside, right? Yeah, like what's the most necessary and the most proper? Because there are a few options.
I think the real question underlying is like, what does necessary represent? And does it mean that there is a sort of a bubble around the restriction, a bubble around the federal government's power that is a restriction of what they can do, and any word, any phrase in the legislation that would give them power outside of those first, the first, I think it's 18.
Yeah.
The first 18 things, any word outside of that goes outside of the bubble and is therefore unconstitutional? Or is it that you can sort of do something tangential that is helpful in enacting those first 18 but gives an extra power? So I think,
Well, Marshall thinks that it's the second of what you said, like, so we have his,
well, we're answering, was he right?
was he
And
right?
we all think he was right.
Yeah, we think he was right.
But his logic makes a lot of sense, but I'm trying to see if there's any, I'm just agreeing with him.
I mean, I guess I'm just trying to kind of play devil's advocate, because like, couldn't the government just say that literally anything is necessary and proper?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Sorry, this
should
isn't
they
my
have that power? Like, should there be a law that like the government can just literally do whatever it wants as long as it calls it necessary and
No,
proper?
but you still have to be able to. There has to be some sort of viable reason that it helps you achieve your goal that is within these. If the government hires a private contractor to make a private road that will be a postal road, is that an example of the government doing anything
Is
they
it a
want?
private road if it's a post road?
They hire a private contractor to make a postal road.
Public post road, yes.
A public postal road. Is that the government doing anything they want, even if it's not spelled out in the Constitution that they can hire a private contractor? That's generally a necessary thing for the government to do, so that it's feasible for them to be able to afford to have postal roads across the country. Because if they were setting up their own postal road service everywhere in the country, is like expensive. If it's so that the government can feasibly achieve a goal, I find that it is necessary and proper, or there's reason for it to be necessary and proper.
So like if it's the most efficient way of doing something, both in time and money and general like, energy, Is that what you mean?
Like, if it achieves the goal, like, you can't just say, on the surface, it has to be the cheapest way possible. Like, if we were going by NASA and we were just buying the cheapest things possible, wouldn't be like necessary and proper of achieving the goal, because the thing would just, the rocket would just break.
Yeah.
The spaceship would break.
It's most effective.
Yeah, so this still has to be, it's not the only the necessary, but it's also the proper, which is you have to have it work. You can't have poster roads that are all going to, the cement is gonna break in 5 years, is not proper, even if that would be the cheapest. So there is a balance between necessary and proper, depending on multiple factors.
I have another sort of thing to add. So I agree with Jacob, and this is more about the bank and the sort of clause is that if you read number 18, the constitutional thing, that could also sort of lay the foundation for banking. It says, well, I'll summarize the beginning, which basically says that the U.S. has the power to sort of change their, like the center of their government to any location which they want, but then it says at the end that the same goes for quote other needful buildings, and so I think that sort of relates that that at least the people who wrote this, they believe that the government will be pretty reasonable with what they define as needful. So while it may be very broad, I think the same thing sort of applies to the bank, where sort of like what Jacob said, that a bank is necessary or needful to sort of put into action the things that are laid out in the previous.
So I don't think 18 is actually broad at all. I think what it's saying is that
Wait, do you
Congress,
mean 18 or 19?
I mean 18.
Okay.
The one right before the necessary and proper.
Yes. I think it's referring to Washington D.C., which was not quite yet to be chosen, if I'm getting my history right there. That they needed to be able to set up the seat of government. So that's what that whole thing refers to.
Except after it says other needful buildings like dockyards, arsenals, stuff like that. It's not just like the center of government.
It's within the district of center of government.
You can have dockyards in other cities as well, though.
Yes, but it's not the federal government's job to do it.
Can we? I want to just before we shift back to the other group, can we come back to the question that Gilad posed, and I want to just get this group's sense of it. Coming out of the Marshall Court, can the federal government just do anything it wants? Do you see something from the Marshall Court that limits the federal government, or does it look like the federal government is pretty much free to do whatever it wants as long as it just calls it necessary and proper?
But if we're talking about just the specific case, are we allowed to say that the necessary and proper clause in this instance wasn't a situation of the government doing everything it wants? It was doing something that was already constitutional, as opposed to us saying, okay, we're going to read out the necessary and proper clause can be used in every instance.
Well, I think I think that's what I'm asking you to take it a step further.
Oh, you are.
I am. I want to see, like, do you guys think that what you ultimately come out of the Marshall Court with is a blank check to the federal government?
Wait, does Elliot, Sarah, or Roby want to say anything?
I had something I wanted to say before we were kind of past that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That question. Oh, Mr. Katz.
Apologize.
Glad you have something to say.
Well, I mean, I was going to pose the question, like, I kind of think it does sort of put this blank check, like, the government can actually just do anything it wants, as long as it says it's necessary and proper, and, like, because, the Constitution has all the limitations, and, like, says everything that the government can and can't do, and then there's this clause that it's, like, and anything else, as long as you say it's necessary and proper. So there's not really a check on that, because who is to say that it's not necessary and proper?
The Supreme Court, they have judicial review.
Yeah.
So if they can, even if the federal government says like this was necessary and proper, the Supreme Court can then say no, it wasn't, and then therefore it wasn't.
But Marshall doesn't rule against the federal government until.
Yeah, he chooses
until-
not
But
to.
he could.
He could have.
But he never does, so I think what
Yeah,
Gilad's saying
but-
is he just basically saying you can do whatever you want?
It's not as
It's
a
a precedent to
it's,
not.
it's, I'm coming
then
out
they
of
do
Marshall's
later.
rulings.
Yeah.
It's not, yeah. It's like, the question is not whether the Constitution says that government, if they can do whatever they want, it's whether I'm coming from the rulings of the Marshall Court, does that set the precedent, like, for the government about being able to do everything it wants.
Marshall might be saying that, but the Supreme Court as a whole doesn't say that.
But
What's the
we're talking about the
difference?
Marshall Court.
But if the
Yeah, like
We're
I'm
talking
saying,
about it
Marshall says that,
as-
but, oh, when I said the
Oh,
Supreme
yeah.
Court as a whole, I meant even since then, not just his
Yeah.
court.
Oh yeah, what were you gonna say?
the Marshall Court sets a precedent for always signing off on whatever the federal government slides in front of them on top of their desks, then I would think that that kind of, just because they have in theory the power to say something is not necessary and proper, but they don't, I think that that kind of says that, you know, that they're not going to, and that the federal government can.
I mean, judges are, they change, the way they react to different things change. One judge might think something is necessary and proper, well, I'd say one judge, but like the Supreme Court, the judges in the Supreme Court at that time can think that something's necessary and proper, and other judges in the future and the past can think it's not, so I think that's part of the problem.
But we're talking about the Marshall Court specifically.
Yeah, but the question is, can the federal government just do anything it wants? We're asking,
According to the Marshall.
According to the Marshall Court.
well,
Judges are supposed to work
it
on
seems
precedent.
so. It seems like that's the way they're behaving. They're kind of letting the federal
I
government do
agree
whatever
with
they want.
how they use social.
Judges are supposed to work on precedent, like if Marshall sets the precedent of signing off on everything, then, you know, in theory, until there's like a different legal argument brought in front of the court that changes their minds, they should do the same thing that Marshall did. Whether that happens is a different story, because judges seem like they tend to not always just rule on the precedents and the facts, but that's besides the point, I think.
You just answered your own question though, that if they have the ability to ignore precedent if they're presenting with something new. So that means even if there is precedent, you don't have to listen to it.
So if you can ignore the precedent, what's the point?
Because the precedent is there as a guide. So like it's like what's the Latin phrase, like something as stasis?
Stare decisis.
Story is stasis, that the precedent is there as a guy that should probably be listened to, but they have to have a really good reason if they don't listen to it.
So what would be the reason that a case would not be considered as necessary and proper if Marshall's saying that this is necessary and proper and setting the precedent that basically anything could be necessary and proper?
Wait, may I ask, what you're asking question? Are you saying like what's the max that you're allowed to do before it becomes
Right.
unnecessary and improper?
And like, is there a max?
According to Marshall.
I
Yeah,
think-
according to Marshall, we're not told.
Yeah, I think at least in this class, we haven't seen enough cases from Marshall to really know like.
Well, go ahead. So, I mean, so we started down the road last class about the commerce. So if you're going to take his logic from the bank case, is there anything that is not possibly justifiable using the Commerce Clause? You could explain anything using the Commerce. We talked about this, I think, last class.
Because of just the way the states are so interconnected.
Everything economically is interconnected. Anything you do is related to somehow to commerce.
It's interesting that the Constitution, in my opinion, really sets that up. Like before the Constitution, I think the states acted much more independently. Then the Constitution comes in, unites them all, makes them all act together, and then also says, oh, and the federal government can regulate interstate commerce.
Oh, sneaky.
Yeah, and like, it builds up the federal government's power while like
Even
yeah.
if it took
Mm-hmm.
I think that given what Mr. Cadden has just said, if there, it's not that number 19 has so much power, it's that number 4 has so much power, and that in order to enact number 4, like, there's a lot of things that could be necessary for the government to do.
I think number 19 is what gives number 4 so much power, because without the ability to enact such laws necessary and proper to do whatever, then how do you do
Number 19
whatever?
gives all of them the power. I'm
Exactly,
saying
yeah, that's
because
what I'm
of-
saying.
Because of number 4's vagueness.
Okay, so I want to set up then the next group's their second round of conversation with the following question. Based on all of this, should the U.S. Constitution have put the necessary and proper clause into the document? So this is still we're still on the Marshall Court necessary and proper. Should everything you've just discussed? Should they have put the necessary and proper clause in? No, I'm not kicking it back to them yet.
Oh, I thought you were.
Staying on you. Staying on the necessary and proper group. Should the necessary and proper clause have been included in the U.S. Constitution?
Yes.
Yeah,
You can't have a country without it.
Yeah, if they don't, then there's always gonna be some people who are gonna say no to like a post office or like.
That's exactly what Marshall says.
Yeah, or just some like stupid things that are like so clearly needed, except it doesn't
Well,
explicitly
you can make the post
say.
office, just not the postal workers.
Yeah, you can have a post office with no public workers, like, there, and like, there are certain things like they didn't have the technology that we have now, and there are certain things that are necessary now that just weren't then. And so I think you need that clause so things that are here so they can like actually happen.
But shouldn't there be some sort of check?
Yeah, the Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Which doesn't apply to state government.
Well,
No, I know.
okay.
So then that is a check.
And also the people sort of count as a check because while it doesn't come for another, well, it's passing every 4 years, but for Congress like
2.
yeah, it's every 2 years. There's still like if the people don't think that what happened was necessary or proper, they can just elect new officials in 2 years. And like it's not the most efficient check, but
Not necessarily because of what we just said before, that that if everyone works on precedent and the precedent is set, and the precedent that that you use a very liberal usage of the words necessary and proper, if that's set, and then everyone has to function on that precedent.
I don't think Congress has to follow precedent.
Well, they wouldn't want to vary too far from what their predecessors said.
Why not?
They might.
No, I know they don't follow like the precedent the way a court would, but to do something drastically different and say, oh, actually, the necessary and proper clause doesn't apply to anything, and it would shut down a lot of what previous people had done.
We were talking about Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay.
In Fletcher versus Peck, that's kind of what the Georgia legislators did, that they said, we're running for office so that we can overturn the corruption of the previous legislators. So I think that is a thing that happens, that they run on just for the purpose of doing the complete opposite.
Yeah.
How'd that work out?
Literally
So
opposite.
you were gonna say something?
I was gonna say the same thing.
Jess, I want you to start the next group. Going back to your original question, do you think that the Marshall Court strengthened or weakened the U.S. Constitution?
So I don't have an answer to if it was strengthened or weakened. However, I think that the Marshall Court helped to give, not a legitimacy, it's not the right word, but helped to give something, figuring out what it is, to the Constitution that it didn't have before, because he made a lot of rulings interpreting different parts of the Constitution, and so therefore, I really want to say that it was strengthened because he was able to interpret the Constitution, but I'm not sure because of what Ben was saying earlier about strengthen having a positive connotation just for the sake of the word.
Hold on, I think you just said something. So you're making the argument. Just make sure I understand this. The Constitution was somehow different after Marshall's
Right.
35 years
He
on the
kind of-
bench.
The court kind of made, give reasoning
Ooh.
and an explanation to laws. That were just.
Can I try something out and if people disagree with it, let me know, but is it an accurate statement to say that Marshall strengthened the power of the Constitution, but he didn't strengthen the actual words of the Constitution? Does that make sense? Like,
That's sort of what I was saying. The
like
Constitution's power is twofold.
He strengthened like the Constitution in the sense that like he made the Constitution like he made basically that everyone has to, like he's the first person that made it so that all branches of government have to look at the Constitution in what they do. People, I mean, they did it before, but it wasn't a necessary thing to do. But also, like the words of the Constitution, because of Marshall, don't mean what they actually mean in English language. Like,
Words don't mean anything in the English language.
They're so vague.
right? What?
But they're like so vague. How can you say they have a specific meaning? Like
Well,
necessary.
necessary means what is absolute, like what you have to do in order to do.
So I want to stay on both. I want to stay on both what David said, and I want to actually address, because the truth is I actually like Jess's question a lot better than the one I posed. So was the Constitution changed as a result of John Marshall's court? I think that's what you're asking. Stay on that, and I think that the argument you just made that I think is worth posing as a question is that that Marshall actually. We could have had a constitution that wasn't a terribly meaningful thing, and he actually made this. He turned our country into a constitutional system.
Right.
That's the words. I don't know if that's a
Yeah,
fair.
no, that's what I was trying to say.
Okay.
But yeah, he took, because I don't think he established judicial supremacy. I think in Marbury, I think he established constitutional supremacy. But yeah, I mean, my question is like, if we're gonna have a supreme law of the land that's like this powerful, is it not right for it also to be so widely interpreted and so like so broad or so liberally interpreted? What do you think, Leo?
I do think that the Constitution was changed. I mean, obviously the physical words were not changed, but I think how people can now interpret the Constitution was changed, because Marshall gave an example of how the words can be stretched and maneuvered the way he likes it. So I think I think it does change how like we read how we can read the Constitution now.
Can you explain that a little bit more? I think the part about how, like him kind of setting precedent, like what kind of precedent is it?
Well, I think he set like he made it so now it's okay to change the word, not change the words, but read deeply into the words and kind of say, oh well, this means this. I think from him doing that, then now it's like an okay thing to do.
He basically established judicial review.
Right.
Which is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's what I'm. Well, yeah.
There's a question on the board now.
Oh, I see what he's saying, because Hamilton did kind of the same thing.
Well, so I wanted to ask him. I think it's a really insightful thing you're saying, and I wanted to push a little more on that. Because Alexander Hamilton was doing the exact same thing from the start, but did John Marshall actually make it? Did John Marshall actually make it more of a countrywide thing or more of an impactful thing than Alexander Hamilton?
Yeah, I think John Marshall like had so much power. Like it's like when someone like small like unknown does one thing, but then like a celebrity does.
It's not like Hamilton
well,
didn't have power.
no, Hamilton does have power, but I think that Marshall has more power. So I think when someone like somewhat famous does something, but then if someone even more famous does it, then yeah.
Well, I don't know if it gives more power, but I think like through judicial review, that's how it got more recognized. Not that it had more power after Marshall. I think he was doing the same thing as Hamilton, but like through establishing judicial review, that's how.
Yeah, I agree with Giselle, because it was from the legal system, it gave him more credibility.
Yeah. Yeah, not that it changed the power of it, just that it changed like the impact, I guess.
My other question is do you guys think that Marshall was actually like, do you think Marshall came up with his decision first and then read the Constitution and found where his decision was? Or do you think he was actually reading the Constitution and then coming up with this decision? Because it seems to me like every decision is just what he every decision he makes is almost unequivocally along Federalist Party lines. And I think does that take away from any of it? Does that take away from what he does? Or does that weaken?
I think should we expect our Supreme Court judges not to be politicians?
Yeah.
Well, until Worcester v. Georgia puts the fear of God in him. Done for the rest of his life.
There wasn't much of his life after.
Yeah, I know.
Those are two good questions.
Good times.
I have a question off of that. Is like reading the Constitution the way that he did, is that like that's like judicial review? Does that mean that judicial review is super like federalisty then?
Say again, is what?
Does that mean like how he read it the way that he did and how he did judicial review? Does that mean that it's like super federalisty? I don't know how to phrase
No,
that.
you're saying
Do you know what I mean?
is judicial review just a federalist, like is it
Yeah.
is it partisan?
Yeah, because it's just like
Or is it-
super reading the Constitution, like you know what I mean?
Yeah. I don't know.
Well, it just says stuff's unconstitutional, it doesn't say you can actually read into it. I don't think it's like either way.
I mean, the Constitution is a federalist document. Like,
Right.
I mean, you could argue otherwise, but like, it creates a federal government. Like, the Articles of Confederation failed, and like, Jefferson is salty for the rest of his life. So, like,
But that doesn't mean the Federalists have to always be right in reading the Constitution.
No, of course not. I mean, like Madison wrote it, but like.
And also, like, the Constitution, like, even Thomas Jefferson, like, the Democratic Republic, believed that having some form of a federal government was necessary, but just having restrictions on it. Like, so it's still, it also was bipartisan, they did have a constitutional convention.
There wasn't really parties there.
Can we just finish off with this last? So I don't want to lose this question that I think was posed. I think Giselle brought. In what ways was a good way to end our unit on this? In what way was judicial review impactful? Like, in what way did it actually make a difference? I think you guys started down that road.
I think the biggest difference is it makes it people actually have to, like, the Constitution is binding. I think that's the difference that we established, is like, people can't go outside people can't go outside the Supreme Court. The government cannot go outside the Supreme Court reading the Constitution.
Or also just like the Constitution is vague, and it gives meaning to the Constitution, makes it like more rigid.
But it also makes it more vague is the problem. Like, it also establishes a precedent of kind of reading between the lines, because judicial review isn't in the Constitution.
But like, Jackson ignores Marshall's court ruling. Like, I think it's almost proof that the real power is in like what the people want, and that like a lot of the time the Supreme Court will align with the people,
right?
Like because they can, as long as the court wins favor with the people, and the government won't usually try to stop it, and then Jackson just screws that. I mean, I guess in Barron v. Baltimore he goes against the people, but he's also like with the state, which is still with the city,
Like,
which
the
is still
question
most
is like,
people.
the question is like, is there is there anything stopping Jackson from doing what he did?
No, like he was the leader of a populist movement. Like he's so powerful.
I just want to point out that two points were just made that are actually like really, really intense. One, the Constitution was not binding before John Marshall, and that John Marshall made it binding. That is a really interesting idea. And that also that judicial review actually is not there. He invents the idea or brings forth this idea of judicial review, but it's really not in the Supreme Court's hands ultimately. There's a myth that it is, but it's really in the hands of the people. Is that, Ben, what you're going for there?
Well, yes, but I think what the people did was unconstitutional. Like what they did was was like wrong on a constitutional and a moral level.
And isn't
But
the
like
whole-
they just have the power to do whatever they want.
Isn't the whole point of the Constitution to stop the majority? Like, because the point of the Constitution is to not set up a pure democracy, and to not,
It's more to control the majority.
right,
Yeah, there we go.
sorry,
Now
to
you get it.
control the majority from hurting the minority. And it kind of obviously failed in Worcester v. Georgia because the majority was just so much more powerful than the minority. But like, so I think the Constitution was still doing its job. It just like there's nothing
It's
that
just where democracy
there's just
fails.
nothing that can
Yeah.
really stop what happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Like democracy can't save the minority, like it just can't.
So anyone hasn't said that much that wants to talk?
Closing statement.
Okay.
Summarize the entire thing.
This is, I mean, this is an amazing set of questions you guys, or comments, or ideas that you guys have put out there. As we're reflecting how much you guys have learned in the course of this unit, we're going to take this now. Well, I don't want to actually introduce Plessy yet. Tomorrow, because I'm going to give you one last opportunity to play these ideas, you're going to have a chance to think through your specific papers. So please bring in, again, for last time, if you want to like flesh it out more, great. But bring in your quote, bring in the why you think this quote is worthy of writing about, and you guys will have an opportunity with a few partners to think that through a little more. That's for tomorrow. I'll see you guys then. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Before we start